there's one more functionality that I'd like to include, and that's the ability to save the game's state, for instance if it has been muted, on game exit. Say you get a phone call and you exit the game temporarily. We'll also make sure that if the player gets a new high score, the high score will be stored even if the game is exited. The first thing we'll want to do is create a new class called data storage inside of our settings in a new package. And in here we'll create a private static const storage ID, which will be a string containing com.gingy.deepturtle, and a private variable called _so, which will be a shared object. This class will also be a singleton class, so let's go ahead and set that up quickly. Now all we need are two simple functions, a load function, which is passed through a field named string, and a save function, which is passed through a field named string and a high score value. So _so equals shared object dot get local storage ID, and return _so dot data, and then field name. And for our save function, it'll be _so equals shared object dot get local storage ID, _so data field name equals val, which is passed through, and _so equals flush. Save flushes the saved data and stores our information. In our game screen, let's create a stopped boolean that will flag if the game has been stopped or not. Flag indicating game was halted for zooming purposes. In our stop function, after we invoke pause elements, let's set this flag to true. _stopped equals true. And in our pause elements function, let's set this flag to false. In our onPlay function, let's have our function first check to see if our stop boolean is true. If it is, we'll invoke our reset function. If not, we'll skip reset. If _stopped, reset. And the last thing we have to do in our game screen is add an invocation to our strike function that we'll call a static function in our game settings class called store high score. And as you might have guessed, this stores our high score. Just going to move it to the end. Let's go back to our game settings class. In our store high score function, let's add the line data storage dot instance dot save, and then in brackets element ids dot high score storage id and high score. And then in our element ids class, since we're referring to static objects, let's go ahead and create them. I'll put them under the heading storage. Public static const high score, storage ID, which is a string that simply says high score, and mute music, which is a string that simply says mute. And I'm going to put them under a heading called storage just for cleanliness sake. Now back in our game settings class, oops, there we go. Now back in our game settings class, let's add a few things to our init function. We're going to point our high score variable to a constant we'll create that points to the loaded high score number from data storage. Const high score number equals number, and then in brackets data storage dot instance dot load, and then in brackets element ids dot high score storage id, and then high score equals high score. Shifting over to our embedded assets class with our sounds manager, let's add the functionality to save our mute status in case of game exit. Data storage dot instance element IDS dot mute music, and then muted. And in our mute function, let's add the line data storage dot instance dot save and then in brackets element IDS dot mute music, comma muted. We also want to create two new functions, one which stops our sounds engine and one which resumes our sound engine on exit and reopening. So we'll call the first one stop application, and inside we'll put gameology sounds engine dot pause song, and then in the second one, which we'll call resume application, we'll write gameology sounds engine dot get sound bracket song dot resume. And then let's add one more line at the end of our init function that loads the previous mute state from local storage. Muted equals data storage dot instance dot load, and then in brackets element IDS dot mute music. In our main class, at the end of our onComplete function, let's add two event listeners, one which listens for the game being exited and one which listens for the game being resumed. So native application.add event listener, and then event.deactivate, and we'll call a function called onDeactivated, and we'll do something similar for activate, and we'll call a function called onActivated. These two functions will simply call our static functions in our embedded assets class, resume application and stop application. Our onDeactivated function will also pause our game. There's one more functionality that I'd like to include, and that's the ability to save the game state, for instance if it has been muted, on game exit. Say you get a phone call and you exit the game temporarily. We'll also make sure that if the player gets a new high score, and let's just change our private function to public so we can see it, and there we go. And that's everything, guys. That's how to make a Flappy Bird type app from beginning to end using Gingy's SDK. Thanks again for watching and following along with me for these tutorials. I hope you were able to learn a bit and have some fun doing it. See you next time.